Columbia, I've seen your mountains high, seen your pretty rainbows and your blue crystal skies, watched your winding rivers as they flow around the bend. To me you're not a stranger, you'll always be a friend.
Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is January 9th, 2019, and this is episode 120. Politicos is the BC Politics podcast. Tell us what you think of the show by leaving us a review or get at us on social media. And most importantly, help us build the show by throwing us a couple bucks at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Scott Leinboom.
And I'm Ian Bushfield. You feeling better?
A little bit, yeah.
That's good, because we need your takes on the PR referendum this week. But we might get sick because we're going to get into by-election fever. I'm sorry. And
it's terrible.
Then we'll talk about the standoffs happening over the LNG pipeline up north with our wildly uninformed takes. First, as always, Politicos is in partnership with BC Today, which is back. You should subscribe. British Columbia's daily newsletter dedicated exclusively to BC politics. Sign up for a free trial to have unique coverage of the BC legislature delivered to your inbox every morning. Listeners to Politicos enter the offer code CITIZEN for access to a special rate. For your free 2-week trial of the newsletter, go to britishcolumbiatoday.ca. So Scott, did you have a chance to listen to the interview we had last week with Brian from Too Close to Call?
Yes, I did. I thought it was a great interview breaking down the details of how the province voted.
Yeah, we did that by Skype, and so I used my MP3 Skype call recorder, so I think the audio wasn't the best.
Yeah.
But hopefully it was still listenable. I had a ton of fun talking to Brian. I really appreciated his time. But we didn't get a chance to get your takes on the referendum. So aren't you happy we're 60% in favor of first past the post?
Happy is not the right word for it. I'm disappointed it did not pass. I'm even more disappointed that this continues the long trend line away from British Columbians voting for PR. Because this one actually did slightly worse than 2009 vote. That's just a little disappointed. My preferred system came in last as well. That surprised me too. I thought dual member would do well.
We didn't end up talking about that, Brian and I, but yeah, mixed member proportional got the most votes, as I think most people would have guessed. But dual member and RUP kind of like were neck and neck, with dual member slipping slightly ahead of rural urban. And I almost wonder if the two system aspect of rural urban worked against it versus dual member in the end is a simple system to work with, even if the mechanics of it aren't as intuitive perhaps to many people.
Yeah, it's, I guess, easier to give a very, the 10,000 foot description of it's a little easier. So that might be why it did well, even if the mechanics are, I think, harder to follow than the mechanics of rural urban.
But so aside from the things I talked about with Brian, what is your takeaway from that referendum? Was it just a flawed process from the beginning? Are British Columbians just not interested in proportional representation? Or is there some other factor at play?
Both and more. I think the process was not done super great. And I think the criticisms that have been thrown around that it's rushed are definitely true. And I kind of understand the urgency because, you need to get this going. And the power sharing agreement probably isn't going to last more than one term, just because the Greens probably aren't going to be holding the balance of power after the next election. So it needed to be done, and then you need lead time for elections BC to be able to implement the new system. So I get why it was rushed, but at the same time, there was a lot of stuff that I think was done quicker, and they didn't have a chance to kind of bring British Columbians along with them. And I think temperamentally Canadians are very conservative when it comes to our institutions, and that's probably a good thing, but it does mean that if you want to make the case to change it, you have to do a lot of groundwork beforehand.
In terms of the process, it was, as we've talked about many times, the, brainchild of Attorney General David Eby. And he was in the Vancouver Sun talking with Rob Shaw very recently about the referendum, finally opening up about his thoughts. And I think it's all concluded with the last quote in there is just, personally, I feel very done with the discussion. And I know David, and I can see him saying that and feel it coming from him of just like, I don't care anymore. But going through the things he talks about, he stands behind the system he set up. He admits that the NDP had promised a yes/no question, but when he went to PR advocates, none of them were united on a specific system. So he said, well, fuck it, we'll put it to British Columbians to see what system they prefer. And apparently they prefer the status quo.
I think having that question be two parts and how to make a choice between two different systems was a challenge. Like, I have friends who pay attention to politics who held on to their ballots for 3 weeks because they didn't know what system to pick. And, if someone with roughly our levels of political knowledge took 3 weeks to decide, even if they're pro-PR in general, what does that say about someone who doesn't spend nearly as much time obsessing about voting systems? So yeah, I think, once again, broken process bit on that. Yeah, I also think part of it too is the problem of making the decision happen inside David Eby's office, because it did lead to the perception that this was a thing being done by the politicians more than a let's change our democracy for the better. It's this party wants to change it, and the Liberals leaned into it pretty hard on that front. And it really didn't help that John Horgan reinforced that narrative when throughout the debate and a bunch of other times he said PR will lead to more progressive governments getting elected, which, if you want to frame it as a neutral, this is something that will improve our democracy, making an explicitly ideological pitch is probably the worst thing you can do.
Well, and I touched on that with Brian, right? And we talked about, was this too partisan? And I pitched the theory that probably hurt things because it was less about thinking about the idea and more about whose team are you on, or are you in favor or not. And Brian pitched the counter argument that if the NDP had actually gone more partisan and taken the Liberals to task and said, you're only against this because your party will blow up if we change this, that may have actually helped. Did you buy that argument?
Well, I think it could work if, you had the Liberals being partisan and everyone else looked non-partisan. But part of the issue with how it was rolled out, like I mentioned, with it basically being a decision of the Attorney General on how it was going to be structured, and then a bunch of the other comments made during it. And this is also part of the problem that a bunch of the PR advocates have used the similar lines too. So that meme's already been kind of out there for a while. But I think you really needed to have the pro-PR side be completely nonpartisan to make that argument then work against the Liberals. And they just looked too partisan for that to have been effective.
So I guess British Columbia is not woke. Where do we go from here? Quebec and PEI are the next places that might consider PR.
Well, I believe Andrew Wilkinson has promised us a citizens' assembly if he gets elected.
Well, and when that was asked to David Eby, he says, well, maybe that might have shifted a few votes and made it a little bit different of a result.
I mean, I think it probably could have actually been quite impactful if they'd, done it over the course of 3 years, and then maybe coincided the vote with the next provincial election. And, that means that the Greens might be out of power and the Liberals might come in. There's a bunch of things that could change between then and now, but, I think it would have actually helped with a lot of the process complaints. So there were quite a few valid process complaints that the NDP never really addressed.
Otherwise, it seems like PR in BC is going to be dead for a while. It's hard to come back from a 60-40 loss, even if you can go, oh, this was wrong and that was wrong, and argue the edge cases.
It's also the second 60-40 loss under two different parties' governments. So it's probably dead for a while now. And I know some people are agitating for politicians should just go ahead and change it. It shouldn't be put to a referendum, which I completely disagree with. And I don't think anyone's going to have the courage to do that anyway.
Well, when we see the Andrew Weaver majority government in 2021 calling it now, he will have MMP or whatever the Green. I don't actually know what the Greens' favorite electoral system is. They will have that.
I think they've always had a general PR. Yeah. I never really gotten into the weeds on what the specific system should be.
So we'll have generic Green PR in 2021 with Premier Andrew Weaver. But until then, I guess we can move on to other discussions.
Well, moving on to our second segment, by-election fever. John Horgan has finally called the much anticipated Nanaimo by-election for January 30th. This is, of course, the one that is being called because the seat is vacant because Leonard Croge stepped down to be mayor of Nanaimo instead. And it's also potentially quite consequential as the balance of votes in the House is so tight. So naturally, everyone's really trying to win this one. The NDP has recruited, I guess, from the federal level, Sheila Meltonson to run for them. The Liberals nominated Tony Harris.
And we've talked about him.
Yep. Last time we talked about this, I don't believe the Greens had settled on their candidate, and it's going to be Michelle Ney.
Daughter of former legendary Nanaimo mayor and
mayor who's immortalized as a pirate statue, I believe.
Yeah, that's normal. She's also a teacher and I think involved in local issues there. So those are the main ones. I will include a link in the show notes of the official writ of election because they're always fun to read. These are the documents that are officially started and say things like, to the district electoral officer for the electoral district of Nanaimo, not greetings, only singular there. We command you that, notice of time and place of election being given, you do cause election to be made according to law. So election will be made on January 30th. And so we do have a few other candidates because we always love talking about every candidate who will be running in an election. The BC Conservatives have nominated their deputy interim leader because sometimes you don't just need an interim leader, but you need an assistant to the interim leader. This is Justin Greenwood, who, if you'll recall, during the PR referendum, the BC Conservatives didn't actually take a position, but they released this video essentially going argument by argument, debunking everything the BC Liberals were saying. So it made you kind of think the BC Conservatives were in favor of PR, and you might also think that because the Conservatives might stand to win a few seats under PR, but no, they weren't actually in support of PR. They just didn't like the Liberal lies being told. That video was starred Justin Greenwood, so he's of that fame. Thanks to Clayton Wellwood for tipping us off about the Libertarian candidate who's running, and they've officially announced that it will be Bill Walker. If you go through the official filings on the Elections BC website, Bill Walker is the only candidate whose financial officer's address is actually in the constituency where they're running. Others are Vancouver, Victoria, the NDP's is in Duncan. I mean, this is kind of irrelevant, but it does show, I think, the Libertarians could claim to have the most connection to Nanaimo.
The email address on the Nanaimo Libertarian website is, what I think, Libertarian Billy.
Liberty Billy.
Liberty Billy, which is like the most libertarian way to structure an email address, it seems like.
Yeah, so Bill has lived in Nanaimo 25 years. He's self-employed mortgage broker and a director of Community Futures for many years. He, quote, believes in individual rights and freedoms and is against socialism and collectivism, as all libertarians would be.
Yeah, that's kind of the water sweat of libertarianism.
But yeah, standard things you'd expect from a libertarian. More consumer choice in all sectors, including education, lower taxes, private healthcare or choice in healthcare.
Privatize ICBC, which, I mean, I guess them and the Liberals are kind of on the same page with now.
Yeah, get rid of government interference on housing affordability and prohibition. He's all about life, liberty, and property. So, yeah, standard BC Libertarian candidate.
Continuing the trend of bad website design for candidates here. The Libertarian one still has a click to edit button prominently displayed at the top of the page. So, few hints to work out, and no Clayton listens to the show, so, maybe get on that. But yeah, moving on to our next candidate, my new favorite fringe party in BC.
This is my real favorite website.
And they're a great website for the Vancouver Island Party, who has put up their leader as their candidate, Robin Mark Richardson.
No, sorry, it's Dr. Robin M. Richardson, PhD. He's a very distinguished Harvard University educated economist, and so you should get his full title and letters in there since it's in his biography. Dr. Richardson has been a member of parliament. I think he was in the Progressive Conservatives briefly in the 80s.
Yeah, so he served a single term in a East Toronto riding. That is from Vancouver originally. I guess ended up in Toronto at some point. So single term before he was defeated by Neil Young.
By single term, you mean single year. It was from 1979 to 1980.
Anyway, the interesting part of this is it's always curious on why someone goes from like a major party to, well, a separatist party on the opposite side of the country from the Rhine he represented.
And to be clear, the Vancouver Island Party doesn't stand for the island separating from Canada, just from British Columbia. They want to be an 11th province.
Yes. And they have a delightful section on their website about terms of confederation, which is basically a laundry list of demands that, Canada will happily agree to for the benefit of having Vancouver Island as its own province.
I mean, to be fair, Vancouver Island has probably around 750,000 people versus Prince Edward Island has 150,000 people. So it's not like it's a negligible claim.
Yeah, like if you were going to pick an island to make its own province, Vancouver Island makes a lot more sense than Prince Edward Island for pretty much any reason but historical path dependency.
We're losing all our PEI listeners now. But what's in their Articles of Confederation for the proposed province of Vancouver Island?
They want 12 MPs to kind of keep Vancouver Island even with New Brunswick. And more interestingly, they want 10 senators, which, for the people who keep track of this, is 4 more senators than all of British Columbia has right now. We have 6. Now, New Brunswick has 10, and that's a huge problem that a province of 800,000-ish people has more senators than the 3rd largest province in the country. So, that should probably be fixed, but Senate reform seems pretty much dead in the water at this moment. But yeah, that seems to be a bit of a reach on their part.
But is it as much of a reach as a rail bridge from the mainland to the island?
No, that is less a reach. So, if you go through there's, of course, BC Ferries gets like a prominent number 5 position in there, and they want the feds to subsidize it. But yeah, if you scroll a ways down, after they want to reopen the E&N railway line.
Which is a good idea.
Yes. Term number 8 is they want to have the federal government honor the original 1871 Confederation Railway promise to Vancouver Island, where they claim that Canada had promised a railway all the way to Victoria. And admittedly, I don't know the history on this one, so I'm not sure exactly what the promise was and whether they're truthful or not. But either way, just doesn't make a huge amount of sense as a thing to do. So the idea is, rather than put it in the spot between the two major population centers like Nanaimo and Vancouver, which is where most bridge proposals are made, and they're horribly impractical and $400 billion in cost and never going to happen. This one would go through, I think, Seymour Narrows up at the top, but that's also nowhere near anything populated in the mainland, and they want to basically run it from Williams Lake down through a bunch of mountains and then cross at the northern part of Vancouver Island where very few people are. So that's fun.
It might help develop large parts of the area. Well, I mean, I guess they may as well just say SkyTrain to Victoria at this point.
Honestly, that's probably more likely to happen.
I think the reason for this weird line they've drawn through the north is it's like the least spans, because you go through the dense. If you look at maps of Vancouver Island a lot, at the northern edge, it's almost hard to see where the edge of the island is because there's so many small islands that sort of connect it to the mainland. And so you can island hop.
It's the obvious place to put a bridge if you completely ignore population.
And the fact there are giant mountains on the mainland side. So
if your sole purpose is to just be able to walk from the island to the mainland and nothing else matters, yeah, that's the obvious place to put it.
Anyway, they like to refer to themselves as Vanilers. I think that's how you pronounce it. Vanislers. Vanilers.
Van Islers.
And that's cute. There's a lot of interesting ideas in here that, like I say, range from the reasonable, region-dependent things to the, no, that's never going to happen.
Yeah, like LRT to suit, which is another one of their things they want the federal government to pay for.
I was going to say provincehood is never going to happen, but fair.
And the one other thing that I really like about them is they have their own party flag, and more parties should have the flag. Now, they've basically just taken the old colony of Vancouver Island flag, but, it's something. You got to start somewhere.
Which reminds me, we should give out a shout out to past guest Justin McElroy, who I think it was in December, ranked the 100 best municipal flags in BC, and that's on his Twitter. Not many of them were great.
No, actually, city flags in general are really terrible. I think one of them they discovered was just being used without the artist's permission who designed the pattern. And
well, I think that was Tofino.
Tofino, it was somewhere in Vancouver Island.
But I actually followed that story because the artist tweeted at Justin, the city doesn't have permission to use this. And then the city looked into it and they found the contract and showed it to him. And he went, oh yeah, I did sign that. And then it's all fine now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so there was a follow-up. It's fine. No one's flag is stolen. Just an artist forgot he sold it.
Okay. Yeah, that was, I think, actually one of the better flags, which made sense because they probably had an artist do it.
I mean, it did look more like a painting than a flag.
Yes, which isn't great from like rules of flag design purposes, but it's better than the ones that look like they've been done in MS Paint. Yeah, there's some bad flags out there. Like some of the ones in the US are terrible. I think some of the ones that stand out as the absolute worst are like the Liberian County flags. Just Google it. They are like really just terrible flags. And you'll see what I mean when you look at them. Anyway, that's probably enough like vexillology nerdery.
Sidetracks.
Yes.
Getting back to this Nanaimo by-election, it looks like we'll have Sheila Malcolmson versus Tony Harris as the main race, with Michelle Ney and Justin Greenwood as possible spoilers, and maybe Bill Walker or Dr. Robin M. Richardson, PhD, will, trail in there with some extra votes.
Who knows? There might be a surprise upset, and Dr. Robin M. Richardson, PhD, might hold the balance of power and, force the province to cede the territory of Vancouver Island.
The only other thing I have to say about this by-election for now, because we'll definitely be coming back to it, is the campaign finance rules are in place for this. So candidates have a cap of $59,216.78, which their party can also spend, but any third parties can only spend $3,062.94. And I don't fully understand.
If you spend 95 cents.
You're in violation of campaign finance law. It's a tiny amount for third parties, which I think there was one group that was trying to go after the NDP in that constituency. It may have even been a lefty group who was just upset, or a union type group, but they stopped running their ads like the second the writ dropped. So it might be a fairly quiet by-election because 60 grand is not a lot of money, and 3 grand for those third parties is tiny. So we'll have to see how that affects it and how this by-election goes. But that decision by Sheila Malcolmson to move to the provincial scene has opened up the seat at the federal level, Nanaimo Ladysmith. And it turns out Elections Canada is saying, based on the rules Justin Trudeau has put in place, there will have to be a by-election in this constituency.
Yes, and normally that wouldn't be that big a deal, except Sheila Malcolmson's made a point of saying she was doing this in such a way that would mean they wouldn't have to call a by-election, so naturally that's exposed to a bunch of deserved criticism.
I think if she had held off resigning federally until the 20th of January, and then she would have been running in both for a while, there wouldn't be a federal by-election, but she didn't want to look like she was hedging her bets or keeping her toe in the federal water.
Yes.
Leonard Krog did in the provincial water, I guess.
Yeah. Except now there's another expensive by-election. So there's accusations being thrown around, probably deservedly a bit, on wasting public money on this.
I never think elections are a waste of money. They give us content.
They do give us content, but,
And they let people have a voice, even if they get to have a voice twice in a year on the same question. Already a few parties are lining up candidates. Namely, the Conservative Party of Canada held a nomination meeting where candidates John Hirst and Jennifer Clark squared off. In the end, John Hirst was chosen overwhelmingly by the Conservatives in Nanaimo, which left Jennifer Clark to decide to go and join the People's Party of Canada, and she's now their candidate. So that's already lining up to be fun.
Yes, and as we'll mention a little bit later, they're also running one in Burnaby South. I'll admit, I was a little surprised they'd been able to throw together 2 candidates for a by-election this quickly.
Well, it turns out both of them are former school trustee candidates who both lost. in the municipal elections in the fall, and both were against the sexual orientation and gender identity curriculum as one of their like core planks of why they ran. So that's great.
Yeah, just great. I cannot wait until after the federal election and Maxime Bernier ceases to be relevant.
I have heard there's some people starting to look into all of these electoral district associations that the People's Party is putting together to see how many extremist fringe type people in there, because they seem to be rushing them.
I could see that. And Bernier hasn't been shy about playing to the base, because it was yesterday he put out something on Twitter, something along the lines of how the UN is a plot to destroy Canada. So, that's a great thing for a former Minister for Foreign Affairs to be saying.
The UN, like the institution Canada was like seminal in creating. I
did not put a huge amount of thought into trying to rationalize that
conspiracy
thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. His party's at 1% in the polls, so let's keep giving them attention. Let's move to the by-elections Trudeau did call, though, because he hasn't called the Nanaimo Ladysmith one, but today he did call 3 others.
In fact, you actually can't call the Nanaimo Ladysmith one. Elections Canada, thing they put out regarding the Nanaimo one, said that it must be announced between January 18th and July 6th. So I guess there's either a delay. There must be a delay for some reason. It must be vacant for so many days, or I don't know the technicalities on this one.
You have to keep the seat warm in case they change their mind.
Yeah. Anyway, so he couldn't actually call the Nanaimo by-election at this point.
All right. Well, Trudeau did call Tom Mulcair's old seat in Outremont, Quebec, the York Simcoe seat in Ontario that was
vacated by Peter Van Loan,
and Burnaby South here in the Lower Mainland, the riding that Jagmeet Singh is eyeing for his big run. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about the Outremont by-election race. I think it's a historically liberal riding that Tom Mulcair kind of took on his personal brand, but it was the NDP's first beachhold into Quebec. If they can hold that, that's a good sign that they don't have further losses coming in Quebec, but I think that's unlikely. So I'd give bets for the Liberals being the odds-on favorite there. York Simcoe went 50% conservative in the last election, and that was after a drop of 13% from the previous.
It's going to be a safe hold for...
But the one we care about, because we're a BC politics podcast, is Burnaby South. So aside from Jagmeet Singh, it looks like we know who most of his competition will be.
Yeah, so the Liberals have nominated Karen Wang, a former BC Liberal candidate and daycare operator.
Yeah, she squared off against, I think, 1 or 2 challengers for the Liberal nomination. She ran for the BC Liberals in 2017, I believe, in the similar area, and otherwise runs a local daycare and is somewhat involved, I guess, in the federal Liberals. What I'm interested to see here is, will her connections to the BC Liberals help or hurt her in a riding like this in this election?
I don't think it's going to do a huge amount.
People might not make that association because they'll go in and pretty much be voting Trudeau versus Jagmeet Singh, even though Trudeau doesn't represent them. The Conservatives have put up Jay Shin, who's a Chinese-Canadian business lawyer and engineer. Seems like a very smart guy. I was reading his bio, and he's got like 4 or 5 degrees. Like, he did human biology and then engineering and then an MBA and then law, and he's taught at universities here and I think in China, and
so either he really likes learning or is really indecisive about his career.
My favorite part of his bio is where he says, finally, Jay is continually working on improving his guitar playing, just as he continues working on improving the lives around him, as he will do if elected as Member of Parliament.
I'm going to assume that means he's going to be playing guitar in Parliament.
I hope so. We lost Kennedy Stewart, who was a guitar player, from Parliament to Mayor of Vancouver. So there's a guitar-shaped hole in Ottawa.
Turns out that's what Burnaby South votes on, is who's the best guitar player representing them.
Best musicians. And as we mentioned, the People's Party has nominated someone. This is Laura Lynn Thompson, who is actually one of the most prominent anti-SOGI activists, I think, in the last municipal elections. She was doing the evangelical church circuit, talking about evil gender ideology coming to warp your children's minds. Cool. In other words, it's between Karen Wang and Jagmeet Singh.
Pretty much, yes. And I imagine the Liberals will be putting a fair bit of effort into this one because, well, if Jagmeet Singh loses, that would be really bad for the NDP less than a year out from an election.
Yeah, Tom Mulcair, for some reason, came out of wherever he's hiding these days and said if Jagmeet loses, he should probably step down as leader, which he didn't do. I mean, he didn't lose his seat.
Yeah, I think losing losing the election after dilly-dallying around for, like a year and a bit, even when there were, they could have gone the traditional route of having someone in a safe seat step down shortly after he became leader. And, the NDP would probably be doing a lot better if Jagmeet Singh had done that. So, there's, I think, a fair criticism that could be leveled at Jagmeet if he loses this one that I think would be a lot more on point than some of the criticisms against Mulcair were after 2015.
I think the other unknown in this election in this by-election, will be what effect the Green Party's decision to just sit it out will have. I don't think they've run up a big score in Burnaby, but the Greens have tried to target some Metro Vancouver ridings. This is Elizabeth May's attempt to honor the sometimes tradition of Canada and a little bit more in the UK of parties not running against other parties' leaders in by-elections to allow them a chance to get a seat.
2015 election, the Green Party got 1,306 votes, which, that's less than the margin of victory Kennedy Stewart had over the Liberals in that riding. So, it could be decisive, although I don't think they would necessarily break towards the Liberals or even the Conservatives.
So the by-elections, I don't know if we actually said, but they're on February 25th.
I think we forgot to lead off with that.
Yeah. So February 25th for those 3 federal by-elections. And I had to look this up because I am still waiting to move to that constituency whenever my condo gets finished building. And the Elections Canada regulation is that, quote, you must live in the riding at the beginning of the revision period of a by-election. I don't know what a revision period is, but apparently it's about 33 days before the election.
Cool.
So that will be January 23rd. So hopefully I am moved in then, or I'm going to be not able to vote. And I like just being able to vote in as many elections as I can. And if this election is decided by like 1 or 2 votes, it'll be really frustrating. But I did find that someone with the same name as the person who owns the development company for my building has donated to the Liberal Party of Canada. It's a fairly common name, so I'm not going to say it. But I just think there might be a conspiracy here if I don't get to move in time.
I think you're reaching on that one. I'm guessing the CEO probably isn't going through like the pre-sale list and go, I wonder who that person is going to vote for. Maybe I should just delay my project.
Especially when they did the pre-sales 2 years ago.
Goes deep.
Yeah. They're playing the long game. But that gives us lots of local elections to cover until I guess we lead into the federal election in the fall. So tons of content for this year. Well, and for a third segment, I don't have a pithy title for this, and I don't think it deserves any wit like that. I want to talk about the LNG standoff up at the Wet'suwet'en, I hope I pronounced that right. That's how I'm going to pronounce it, but Indigenous peoples in northern BC, with all the caveats that neither of us are Indigenous law experts or deep backgrounds in this, but it is a big issue in BC right now. So the RCMP are enforcing a injunction order by this LNG company that's trying to bring a pipeline.
By the court.
Well, yeah, the injunction comes from the court, but it was...
like it sounded like they were just doing what the company wanted. So it's important to be clear.
No, yeah. The company who's trying to build this LNG pipeline from about Dawson Creek to Kitimat filed for an injunction to make sure that they could put this through all the lands where there are starting to be some protests. The company had made agreements with the elected bands of all the Indigenous nations along the route. And that sounds like, yay, good for reconciliation. But what happens is there's actually 2 essentially leaderships of many of these nations. There's the elected band and what are called the hereditary chiefs. And this all dates back to John A. Macdonald's own approach, where when he introduced the Indian Act, he said The great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. So we basically wanted to get rid of the existing government systems, whatever they were, and impose something that was more replaceable, essentially, that they could just roll in. And so you have these unceded territory tribes across BC who might have hereditary chiefs and who might have elected chiefs. And it's a tension. In some cases, there's overlap too. Here in the Squamish Council, for example, there are hereditary chiefs on the elected council. It's not simple. In the Wet'suwet'en case, the hereditary chiefs do not want this pipeline to go through their territory. And so they've been protesting it for a long time. That's what motivated the company to file the injunction. And now the RCMP are enforcing it and going in, arresting people. About, I think 14 got arrested earlier this week.
14's the number that I've seen everywhere.
And that's spurring solidarity protests here in Vancouver and across the country. I think people were at Parliament. So it's a big story and lots is going on. And I mostly really just wanted to touch on this to highlight that tension of those two kinds of governments and how that gets glossed over a lot, because it's very easy to think in such simplistic terms as, oh, there's approval from the First Nations. Well, that's not always clear cut.
Yeah, this whole case, it doesn't seem like there's a particularly clear understanding of where the authority on this is, which, yeah, leads to confusion. And naturally, people who are very strongly opposed or supportive of this project have, latched onto one aspect of that as the be-all and end-all, which has only added confusion.
And the provincial and federal governments, because of that lasting colonial policy, deal primarily with the elected councils. It's easier for them, whether it's right or not. And so from their point of view, it's somewhat fine. The RCMP is doing their job. And to be clear, neither Horgan nor Trudeau want to touch this. They're just saying it's the court's decision and the RCMP are doing their thing.
And it's kind of the right call, because it's not great when the politicians start dictating what the courts decide.
Or what police do.
Yes.
Or don't do. Other than within sort of oversight things.
Yeah, there's like
specific things.
Yeah, if the objection is to what the outcome is, then the logic, or then the place to go about that is what the underlying laws are, because you don't want the RCMP ignoring the courts, and you don't want the politicians trying to do an end run around the courts. So, it's complicated, and there's a good reason everybody's kind of just going with the, this is what the law says we're going to do, so we're going to do it.
Where it gets even more complicated is the office of the hereditary chiefs of the Wet'suwet'en. That's what we're talking about, the people who are protesting. They're the ones who are actually in the current treaty process with the provincial government. So when I say the provincial government isn't actually talking to them, well, that's not true. They're just talking to them on a different level. So when they're talking about recognizing what territory is theirs and coming to an eventual treaty, they are working with the hereditary chiefs, which would imply they should try to recognize. So it doesn't really answer what the best route forward is, just that it's tense.
Yeah, the whole thing is a messy, complicated situation, and I think anyone trying to give this a simple narrative is kind of glossing over a lot of some important details and trying to make it more clear-cut than it is.
And it does come back to this tension that's inevitable because of the fucked up, frankly, messy history of Canada's attempts to colonize. Well, Canada's history is one of colonization, and in BC, where there wasn't even the attempt to sign treaties with Indigenous nations, it leaves it an even bigger mess, because in much of the rest of Canada, you do have treaties to fall back on, and you can argue those weren't fairly negotiated, because in some places people were essentially starved into signing them, and in other situations, or even the same situations, the spirit of the treaty wasn't actually upheld, and payments haven't been met or included with inflation. And so all of that is a mess, but BC doesn't even have that structure. We just kind of have people started moving here when there were already people here, and now we all have to live together and get along. And when people say we don't want a pipeline on our land, we have to find a way to work that out.
And then
And
you have
maybe
the
there is no way,
complicated of
but-
like who actually represents the people. And I've seen it suggested that the chiefs are the ones who hold title to it, the lands, and that doesn't actually appear to be necessarily the case because, once again, the law is messy and unsettled on this. So, yeah, the whole thing is complicated.
And then there's an additional issue as the RCMP moved in to do the actual enforcement and clearing the protests, that it seemed like once again they took some heavy-handed tactics. Now, no one was injured or hurt as far as I know, but they did cite safety concerns in needing to bar media from attending. And I saw reports on Twitter, I don't know how well this was verified, that there was a cell phone blackout in the area that seemed either coincidental, according to the RCMP, or maybe knocked out temporarily to just smooth things.
It's probably was done on purpose. And, I wish they'd just come out and say, yeah, for operational reasons, we disabled cell phone access or something.
Then they face a bunch of charter challenges and freedom of expression violations, which they probably don't want to.
I don't think you actually have a charter right to use a cell phone.
But the RCMP doesn't probably have the right to just shut the system down. I hope they don't.
I actually don't know what the law on this one is, but I don't think it would be a charter thing. It might be a thing, and who knows if they made a voluntary request to the telecom provider. Who knows what the actual situation there is, but it would have been nice if they could have just come out and said it, and said they needed to do it for operational reasons, and just be a little more honest about that.
Well, and this connects to a study that was highlighted in BC Today's issue this morning, as well as reported on in APTN a few days ago, which is a new academic study published in, I think, the Canadian Journal of Sociology, where a few researchers got a number of FOI requests that show that the government and RCMP don't assess Indigenous protests in Canada based on factors of criminality, but more often about the sympathy that could be gained and garnered by the protests. Essentially, they target those that seem like they're going to gin up larger protests as a way to just kind of clamp everything down. And it pretty much highlights the risk assessment is not so much about these people are actually a threat to people who are building pipelines or otherwise, or that they're going to cause damage, but they're just kind of focused more on the corporate rights and private property, and especially over the Indigenous rights and title. And so I'll throw a link to that worrying piece. And for people who take strong side with the Indigenous protesters, this will be a no-duh kind of study. And people who are very cynical of RCMP operations will say the same. But it's a little worrying when RCMP internal documents are being a bit flippant, or not even flippant, but direct about what their goals are in engaging in these kind of policing actions. Because the police have lots of discretion on how to enforce, as far as I know.
Well, at least with this case, they had some discretion on how to enforce.
Police have discretion on what tactics to use and what approach to take. They don't always have to come in, SWAT teams, full armor, battle shields ready to crack skulls. There can be a bit more negotiated, peaceful agreements. And as far as I can tell, the protesters in this situation have been entirely peaceful and have been explicit in that. So does this end up badly for Horgan and Trudeau, as both talk about implementing UNDRIP into federal and provincial laws, respectively?
I mean, the honest answer is probably no, just because Canadians generally don't vote on these issues.
Sad truth.
Yeah, I could see it hurting, maybe Horgan a bit, but it would probably only be the very hardcore activist base, and they'll probably don't come back to anyway come next election. So it's realistically, I can't see this being a major thing unless this spirals into weeks-long protests or this goes on for months. But yeah, it's probably not going to have a huge amount of consequence beyond the fact that there's probably going to be a Supreme Court precedent set when this reaches the higher levels that will be fairly impactful.
Yeah, that's a good point. On the courts have been slowly working to interpret more what Aboriginal rights and title means. We'll probably try to get Ian Waddell on the podcast at some point because he's got a new book out about his memoirs and his life where he talks about bringing in Section 35 of the Charter, which he was instrumental in, And that's the section of, or not the charter, the Constitution. It's actually outside the charter, so it's totally clear of the notwithstanding clause and other implements. But that's explicitly recognized as Aboriginal rights and title in this country. And the Supreme Court has been using that not in a very broad, but essentially an accurate way, arguably, to say if people lived here, then they do have some claim to rights and title of their land. And that has motivated these things like duty to consult by the federal government and other approaches that I guess we're still sort of working out the kinks of. And this question of who does the government have to consult with will probably be the result of this debate. Just to close off, this has been a tough situation for Horgan to deal with, but it's been even tougher for BC Forestry Minister Doug Donaldson, who's MLA for the Stikine riding in northwestern British Columbia, which goes right up to the edge of where these protests are actually happening. So the majority of the Wet'suwet'en people live in Donaldson's riding, about 80% according to Star Vancouver. But the actual Unit Stoughton checkpoint where these protests are happening is in the neighboring riding of Nechico Lakes, where John Rustad for the BC Liberals is MLA. And he's very critical that Donaldson decided just before the RCMP moved in that Donaldson met with the hereditary chiefs, which the Liberals are accusing of breaking the rules and siding with the protesters.
The main criticism is that, there's a court injunction against the arguably protesters are in violation of the law, and that having a minister of the crown show up does undermine the rule of law. And it's not an entirely unreasonable argument the Liberals are making here. So I can definitely see where it's coming from. But Donaldson, wasn't taking many media interviews right away. But from what I gather, it was definitely a fairly friendly and cordial visit he had up there, which I think has added fuel to the fire.
Yeah, he denied media right away, but he does give some comments to the Star Vancouver, and he says that his visit represented, quote, an acknowledgement of the authority of the hereditary chiefs in recognition of the 1997 Delgamukwa case, which set some of the color or shape of what rights and title look like in Canada. But even that is debated about whether how that extends in this situation.
Yeah, I actually looked up the case, and if you control, it's a 200 paragraph case. I didn't read the full ruling on it, but yeah, if you control F hereditary chief in there, it's mentioned 4 times. It's it doesn't, the bits I was able to read through, and I full caveat here, I may have missed it, but it didn't appear to have actually settled do the hereditary chiefs have the title over the land in this case.
And so I think the decision to attend the meeting, I have trouble faulting him for it, because it's not like he made a decision out of it. And hearing someone out, even if they're in the midst of what you consider, assume it is fully illegal violation, it is in violation of a court injunction type protest. I'd rather our politicians hear from protesters and industry on all sides than not.
Yeah, I think the problem was more that he didn't appear to be acknowledging the court ruling. It looked like he was siding with the protesters, which may be fine for your regular MLAs, but as a minister of the crown, there's implications to that can't really be ignored either. So the Liberals, I don't think are unreasonable by pointing out the issues with that. I don't know how much it's going to net them.
And I guess the other side of it is, who does this play to? Because there's the strict legal arguments about the legitimacy, but then there's the larger political debate about, is this about pushing a pipeline through or supporting protesters' right to their land? And the Liberals are clearly taking the side of, the pipeline was approved, the nations were on board, at least the elected chiefs, and they are called elected chiefs because there was a full appreciation of the irony of using that word. That was also, everything about this is problematic, but the Liberals are essentially just trying to make a political argument here that this is about, a small group of protesters versus the rule of law versus protesters who are talking about how their rights have not been recognized or appreciated for decades, and this is just another transgression.
Yeah. There's I think, a valid point that there needs to be at some point be finality on these questions when they're open, and the who speaks for the nation here is clearly a big question mark. But if there wasn't the question on the hereditary chiefs and there was a protest after the elected representatives of the people of that nation had signed off on it, it would be, I think, a less murky question. But you could definitely see why, if there was a protest in that situation, there would be concerns that if it then stopped it, you would never really have finality and actually have a clear question on, or a clear answer on, can we go ahead and can we not? So in that sense, I think there is a valid point about, needing to have this resolved once there is a decision. And, I think plenty of people are critical of how that decision was made, but, once that's been done, being able to go ahead, there's I think, a valid point there. So I can see where the Liberals are going with this. And also, I think it plays into a larger issue that generally it's really hard to get stuff built in Canada. And this is something I don't think we actually talked enough about, is that, it's like it just takes longer and longer to get big, important infrastructure done. And, putting aside the question of whether or not a gas pipeline is a good idea, just being able to quickly get stuff built is something a prosperous nation should be able to do in theory. And I think the Liberals are somewhat exacerbated, annoyed that it does take so long to get stuff done. You hear this common argument from, federal parties as well. And, if it takes this long to get a gas pipeline done, it will also take a long time to get a bunch of electrical infrastructure done. And we're going to electrify the province to phase out fossil fuels. Being able to have that quick turnaround is actually going to be really key. Once you kind of strip away the surface layer of, do you like gas pipelines? There's, I think, a lot of issues under the surface there that the Liberals aren't entirely wrong to be talking about.
It's almost like dealing with 150 years of disingenuous and bad faith colonial interactions with Indigenous peoples is impeding our ability to work as a
it's complicated.
Yeah,
but there's, at the same time, like
I think there's reason to be.
There's reason to be not. Yeah, I mean, there's reason to be optimistic, as I think you were about to say, but there's also, I think, reason to be dissatisfied with the House on the protests, and the inevitable result of that is, even if you understand and acknowledge why we are in this situation.
As I sort of caveated off the start of this, we're clearly not experts on this topic, and people are probably going to be mad at some point or another. So if you know someone good we should be talking to about this, who's interesting, who has deep thoughts about it, get them to add us and we will bring them on the show and have another deeper discussion, because I think these are fascinating and important topics.
Moving on to quick takes. The much talked about, at least in some circles, recall campaign against Daryl Pleckis looks like it's about to get underway, with Robin Roy, who's been running the Recall Daryl Pleckis Facebook page, has announced that he's going to be intending to file the official Get a Recall campaign going paperwork towards the end of this month.
So this is all detailed in a piece by Rob Shaw in the Vancouver Sun, and we'll throw a link in the show notes. Robin Roy claims to have 300 volunteers who've divided up the Abbotsford South constituency so that when they drop the writ or whatever gets dropped on a recall campaign, they can start door knocking and use their 60 days to get as many signatures as they can to try to trigger that by-election. For perspective, Abbotsford South has around 41,000 registered voters, so the recall threshold is about 16,400, and Pleckis got 11,700 votes in the 2017 election. So it's not impossible, but there has never been a successful recall campaign in BC. There's been one that came close, where the MLA just resigned out of disgrace, but otherwise it's still a super long shot.
It's not going to happen. This is just wasting everyone's time, because the threshold is so high, it basically can't happen.
The Facebook page has 100 likes. It actually had 94 this afternoon, and it jumped to 102 when I last looked, so it is growing by the day. That said, yeah, I'm super skeptical. Robin doesn't seem to have and I think he admits as much, any political experience, so he's not worked on campaigns. His main job is running something called yourcomputertech.biz. So you can find his website, which, let's just say it's up there with the Vancouver Island Party's website. But if you need web design and hosting services, Robin might be your guy out in Abbotsford from $10 a month. But otherwise, yeah, it's recalls don't work. But I don't want to even say good luck to him. I mean, I'm not a huge Daryl Plecas fan, and things still need to be figured out there. I don't feel like a recall campaign is necessary.
It gives us something to talk about, but like it's gonna go nowhere. And
I'm not just saying that as like a partisan. I don't think there's even like BC Liberal MLAs who I'm like, they should be recalled. No one's been super incompetent in this legislature. I mean, there might be some who haven't been great, but none are failures.
Yeah, no,
they've all been showing up to work.
Yes, which you can't always say for federal MPs. Yeah. As we talked about a few weeks back.
Yeah, recall campaign, it's always fun to watch it fail. But speaking of things that failed, Sam Cooper in Global News has another big scoop, which follows up on these charges that were dropped in this money laundering e-pirate thing that was happening. So we talked about, I think it was in December or late November, David Eby coming out with this announcement that charges were stayed in one of the big investigations the RCMP was working on. He was exacerbated, not really knowing much, and really frustrated that charges weren't going forward in something that's otherwise very important. But what Sam Cooper releases is the reason it seems like these charges were stayed is because federal prosecutors mistakenly exposed, quote, the identity of a police informant who they feared could have been killed if the case proceeded.
Yeah, that's bad.
So essentially when they got to the discovery portion of the trial, where the prosecution has to give all the files they can to the defense so that they can make a good defense, they included things that weren't vetted because there's some anonymization they would have to do to make sure their informants are kept safe, sort of reasonable procedures. And they didn't do that. They did manage to get the files back and like sort of cleared it, but by this point they'd kind of botched the whole trial and had to just give up, which is really bad because it seems like this had it started as something that was maybe like a couple million or maybe 10 million or maybe 100 million. But then the scale of this money laundering scheme is now pegged around $1 billion. That included casinos here and like Chinese gangs and Mexican gangs and cartels around the world. And it was just getting a prosecution there would have been good for cleaning up corruption in the province. But putting police informants at risk is a red line for the prosecution service for probably good reason. And so they had to drop this. Cool.
I really don't have anything to add beyond it's bad.
If we want to talk about like wasted money, like the amount of time and human resources and capital just probably spent on this case, getting it to like essentially trial and then going, oh shit, we screwed this up at the last minute.
Mm-hmm.
It's so frustrating.
Yeah, it was when Paul Manafort's lawyers forgot to redact stuff properly, it was a little amusing, but like this is the exact opposite. And there really isn't much to say than like this really sucks, and the prosecution service probably shouldn't do that ever again. And hopefully everyone's figured out that you really do need to check this stuff before it goes out.
Like, and I imagine it was a lot of documents. Like a large case would have a ton of stuff. But
yeah, stuff gets missed sometimes, but it shouldn't.
Yeah. Well, hopefully there will be another chance to get the baddies.
And that has been Politos. Find links to everything we talked about at politos.ca. You are a first-time listener. Make sure to subscribe and let us know what you think. Support the show and get access to our exclusive Slack channel at patreon.com/politos. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Our intro music credit is Beautiful British Columbia by Sergei Plotnikov. Thanks for listening.